They said the house had 3 rooms, one for living, one for dying, and one no one dared to open. Julian Cain had already buried his wife, his past, and most of his hope in that frozen Montana dirt. He wasn't looking for salvation, but when he raised his hand at a backwater auction and bought 2 near-broken girls no one else wanted, something shifted in the silence of that house. He didn't speak of kindness, and he sure as hell didn't believe in redemption, but for the first time in 3 winters, the fire didn't feel so cold. Sometimes family isn't who you're born with, it's who stays after the storm. What do you think about men like Julian and the girls he brought home? Leave your thoughts down in the comments. Let's see how this all plays out, shall we? The dust of the high plains had long since settled over the war, but for Julian Cain, the silence it left behind was a heavier blanket than any winter snow. His 3-room house, hunkered down against the wind on a sweep of land that offered little comfort but vastness, had grown quieter still since Anna breathed her last. The sickness had taken her slow, a cruel thief, and now the rooms echoed with the absence of her. He'd spent the better part of a morning, the sun already climbing with a promise of heat, out by the struggling mesquite at the edge of what they'd once called their yard. One by one, he'd committed Anna's things to the stubborn earth, not the necessities, not the things a body needed to keep on living, but the small treasures that were wholly hers, a slim volume of poetry, its cover worn soft as dowskin from her touch, a packet of lavender, its scent now a ghost in the dry air, a pressed wildflower, faded, but still holding the shape of a forgotten spring day. He hadn't rushed. Each item was a memory turned over in his hands, a dull ache in his chest. When the last was covered, the shovel scraping against rock and dirt, he'd stood for a long moment, the brim of his hat shading his eyes. It felt like closing a door, a heavy one, and knowing, deep in his bones, it wasn't meant to be opened again. The past was a buried thing. Life, such as it was, had to go on. Supplies dwindled. So, a few days later, Julian hitched Old Bess to the buckboard and made the slow trek into the small settlement that passed for a town. Miller's General Store wasn't much, but it had what a man needed: flour, coffee, salt, perhaps a new axe handle if the old one was past mending. It was there, tacked crookedly amongst notices for lost cattle and a plea for a farrier, that he saw it, a piece of foolscap. The ink stark and brutal. Twin sisters, 19 years, orphaned, for marriage or labor. Inquire Nolan's horse market. Julian read it once, then again, a cold knot tightening in his gut. Marriage or labor. The words were as coarse as burlap, an ugly stain on the day. He'd seen hardship, plenty of it. The war had scoured the decency from some folks, left others desperate. But this was a different kind of barren. He thought of Anna, of the gentleness she'd brought to his life, a stark contrast to this raw commerce of souls. He bought his coffee and flour, his face grim, the image of that notice seared behind his eyes. Sleep offered little respite that night. The wind moaned around the eaves of the lonely house, sounding almost like a woman's lament. He saw Anna's face in the flickering lamplight. Then the stark, unseeing eyes he imagined for those 2 girls. 19, barely women. What kind of life awaited them at Nolan's? A place known more for hard bargains on livestock than for tender considerations of the human heart. The next morning, the decision sat heavy but firm in him. He rode out, not in the buckboard, but on his sturdiest gelding, leaving Old Bess to her pasture. Nolan's was a good half-day's ride. A collection of dusty corrals and rough-hewn buildings smelling of manure, sweat, and cheap whiskey. Men of all sorts milled about. Ranchers looking for cow ponies, freighters needing draft animals, and the harder sort, eyes narrowed, looking for a different kind of bargain. He found them easily enough. They were standing near a water trough, apart from the animals, yet displayed much the same. Twin girls, as the notice promised, though not identical if you looked close. One, a little taller, stood straight, a spark of defiance in her shadowed eyes, her hands clenched at her sides. The other, slighter, seemed to wilt, her gaze fixed on the dusty ground, her shoulders hunched as if to ward off a blow. Both were clad in faded, ill-fitting calico, their faces smudged with grime and fear. A burly, unshaven man with a proprietary air lounged nearby, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. Julian didn't waste words. He approached the man. The girls, from the notice. The man grinned, a yellow, unpleasant sight. Prime. They are. Strong, good teeth. Take a look. He gestured, as if they were fillies. Julian's gaze flickered to the girls, then back to the man. His voice was low, flat. How much? A sum was named. Julian didn't haggle. He counted out the worn bills, the man's eyes gleaming with avarice. No papers were exchanged, just the currency and a curt nod. A solly, like any other in that place, except it wasn't. Not to Julian. He turned to the girls. The taller one met his eyes, searching, wary. The smaller one flinched when he looked her way. Get your things, Julian said, his voice still quiet, but with an edge of command that brooked no argument. They had no things, save the clothes on their backs and a small, shared bundle that looked to hold little more than a few pitiful keepsakes. The ride back to his homestead was a silent affair. The girls rode in the buckboard he'd arranged to borrow from a grudging acquaintance at the market. While he rode alongside, he could feel their eyes on him, questioning, fearful. What kind of man was he? What did he intend? The silence stretched, taut and heavy as the miles. It was near dusk when they reached his small ranch. The air was cooling, the sky streaked with the fading colors of sunset. He led them to the main house, into the small room that had once been a spare, but had seen little use. It was clean, if bare, with a narrow bed and a small washstand. This will be yours, he told them, his voice gentle now. Weary, he gestured to an adjoining door. That leads to a small storage room. I'll clear it. It can be a second sleeping space. You'll have your privacy. The taller one, Mabel, she'd whispered her name when he'd helped her from the buckboard, finally spoke. Abigail, her sister, huddled close behind her. Sir, Mabel began, her voice trembling despite her effort to keep it steady. What? What do you expect of us? Julian looked from her face to Abigail's, pale and tear-streaked in the dim light. He took off his hat, running a hand through his graying hair. He was tired, tired of the dust, tired of the loneliness, tired of the ugliness in the world. He met Mabel's gaze directly. I expect you to be safe here, he said, his words slow, deliberate. To have a roof and food, nothing more. He paused, letting the words sink in. I saw that notice. I paid money to undo a bad thing, not to buy people. You understand. This ain't a purchase of persons. This is a setting right of a wrong. He saw the flicker of disbelief in their eyes, then a dawning, fragile hope. It was a small thing. That hope, in the vast emptiness of the prairie. But it was a start. He turned to leave them, to give them space. "There's stew on the stove," he said, his back to them now. "Help yourselves. We can talk more in the morning." He stepped out into the cool of the evening, leaving them in the lamplit room. The door to Anna's past was closed, buried in the earth. Perhaps, just perhaps, another door, one he hadn't anticipated, was creaking slowly open. He didn't know what lay beyond it, but for the first time in a long time, the silence of the house felt a little less empty. The days that followed settled into a quiet rhythm, a fragile truce with the vast, often harsh, silence of Julian Cain's homestead. The house itself, which had seemed to hold its breath in a perpetual state of mourning for Anna, began to draw shallow, tentative sighs. It was still a quiet place, the kind of quiet that sinks into your bones, but the chill at its heart had lessened, replaced by a hesitant warmth, like the first pale sun after a long winter. Mabel, the elder twin by a mere 30 minutes but years in spirit, watched Julian with eyes that missed nothing. Her suspicion was a tangible thing, a shield she held against a world that had taught her harsh lessons about the nature of men and their so-called charity. Every gesture of his, every quietly spoken word, was weighed and measured. He'd given them a room, decent food, and asked nothing in return. It was too different, too unlike the brutal bargains she'd come to expect. She scrubbed the floors with a fierce energy, mended their worn clothes with meticulous stitches, as if daring him to find fault, to reveal the true cost of his magnanimity. Each evening, when he retired to his own room, leaving them to the uneasy peace of theirs, she would whisper to Abigail, "He wants something. Men like that always want something." Abigail, softer, more porous to the subtle currents of the house, felt it differently. She was a creature of shadows and whispers, her spirit bruised but not broken. While Mabel armed herself with distrust, Abigail found a strange comfort in Julian's quiet presence. He moved with a deliberation that spoke not of menace, but of a weary sort of grace. He didn't pry, didn't press. His silence was a balm, a stark contrast to the leering demands and crude speculations they had endured. She appreciated the way he'd look out at the endless horizon, a sorrow in his gaze that resonated with her own unspoken griefs. She found herself listening for the steady rhythm of his boots on the porch, the low murmur as he spoke to his horse. These small sounds were anchors in the unsettling newness of their lives. There was one part of the small house that remained an enigma. A door at the very end of the narrow hallway, firmly closed. It was an ordinary door, weathered pine like the others, but it felt different. It held a stillness, a finality. Julian never approached it, never spoke of it. Sometimes, passing by, Abigail would feel a faint drift of something from beneath it. Not dust, but a lingering scent, too faint to name. Perhaps lavender, perhaps just old memories sealed away. Mabel saw it as another secret, another piece of the puzzle that was Julian Cain. Abigail felt it was a place of sorrow, best left undisturbed. Several weeks into their stay, a fierce dust storm blew in from the plains, confining them indoors for the better part of 2 days. The wind howled like a banshee, rattling the window panes, and the air grew thick with a fine, gritty powder that settled on everything. Julian, restless, spent time mending tack in the main room, the scent of leather and oil filling the air. Mabel sat by the small window, staring out at the maelstrom, her jaw tight, seeking a distraction, a sense of usefulness. Abigail had taken to gently cleaning, organizing the few belongings in their shared room and the small adjoining storage space Julian had cleared for them. It was in an old, overlooked wooden crate tucked into a corner of that storage space, a crate that held Julian's few spare linens and some out-of-season clothes, that she found it beneath a folded woolen shirt. Her fingers brushed against a small, leather-bound journal and a packet of letters, tied with a faded ribbon. Curiosity, a rare and fluttering thing for Abigail, overcame her. She knew she shouldn't, but the house held so many silences, so many unspoken things. One envelope was addressed in a looping, feminine hand to Julian Cain, my husband, and the contents were clearly from a woman named Eliza. Her breath caught. Eliza, their mother's name. With trembling fingers, she pulled out the creased pages. The letter wasn't dated in the usual way, but spoke of a time of leaving, of a heart torn between the peace I must find and the duties I forsake. Mabel, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the shriek of the wind. Mabel turned, her eyes questioning. Abigail held out the letter. Look, together, huddled in the dim, dust-filtered light, they read. The words painted a picture of a woman they barely remembered, a woman tormented, seeking an escape from a life, or a past, that had become unbearable. And then, the sentence that made the world tilt. My dearest Julian, you came into my life after so much sorrow, a quiet harbor. These girls, my Mabel and Abigail, they are of my blood, my past. I leave them to the winds. But if fortune deserts me entirely, if the peace I seek is but a phantom, know that my heart will try to find its way back to them, or guide them, somehow, to a kindness they deserve. You are a good man, Julian, kinder than I deserved. Julian, their mother's husband, this quiet, somber man who had bought them from the dregs of a horse market. He was their stepfather. The wind howled outside, a fitting chorus to the storm that had just broken within the small room. Mabel stared at the letter, her face pale, her usual defiance momentarily shattered. He knew, she finally breathed. All this time, he knew who we were. Abigail shook her head, tears welling. I don't know. Maybe he only knew our mother, not us. But the letter implied a deeper connection, a knowledge. Their mother had been his wife, Eliza Cain. The revelation hung heavy in the air, thick as the dust. Their mother hadn't just vanished into the ether. She had made a choice, a desperate one, and in doing so, had unknowingly, or perhaps knowingly, woven Julian Cain into the fabric of their lives long before that dreadful day at Nolan's market. Eliza had left, seeking a solace she couldn't find, but she'd left behind a thread, a connection to this man, a man who, for reasons now terrifyingly personal and profound, had pulled them back from the brink. The locked door down the hall suddenly felt less like a mystery and more like a part of this tangled history. Was that Anna's room, the first wife, or was it the room he had shared with Eliza, their mother, now a sealed tomb of another, more recent, loss? We have to ask him, Mabel said, her voice regaining some of its customary steel, though a new uncertainty flickered in her eyes. We have to know what he knew. Abigail clutched the letter, the thin paper, a fragile link to a past that was rushing back with the force of the storm, the silence of the house, once a space of unknown intentions, now pulsed with unspoken truths, with the ghost of their mother, and with the daunting reality of the man who was, by law and by blood, bound to them, The dust storm blew itself out by the second morning, leaving behind a world washed clean and eerily still. The air in the small house, however, remained thick with unspoken words, with the weight of the letter clutched in Abigail's hand. When Julian came in from checking on the animals, his face etched with the weariness of the storm, Mabel stood, barring his way to the stove where coffee was brewing. Abigail hovered behind her, a pale shadow. "We found something," Mabel stated, her voice flat, holding none of its usual defiance, but a raw, exposed nerve instead. She nodded towards the letter Abigail held out with a trembling hand. Julian looked from one twin to the other, his gaze lingering on the faded ink of the envelope. A deep sigh escaped him, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of years. He didn't take the letter. "Eliza," he said, not a question, but a quiet acknowledgement. He looked older in that moment, the lines around his eyes deeper. "Your mother, she was your wife." Mabel pressed, the words barely more than a breath, yet sharp as splintered wood. He finally took the letter, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle on the fragile paper. He didn't read it. He knew its contents by heart. After Anna passed, it was a difficult time for her, for all of us. I reckon she wrote that she left to find peace. Abigail whispered, her eyes searching his face for an answer to questions she couldn't yet voice. Did she find it? Julian looked out the small window, towards the vast, indifferent horizon where the land met the sky. "I don't know, child. I truly don't." She carried a sadness in her, a restlessness, like a bird caught in a storm, always looking for a way out. He paused. "She loved you both, fiercely." That letter, it was her way of trying to make sense of leaving, of hoping for a way back to you if things didn't work out for her. "And the room?" Mabel asked, her gaze flicking down the hall. "The locked one." Julian's eyes followed hers. "That was her room. Ours. For a time. I haven't been in there since she left. 3 years now." He met their gaze again, a profound sorrow in his own. It didn't seem right. The conversation hung there, suspended in the quiet morning light. There were more questions, a lifetime of them, but for now, the truth, stark and unadorned, was enough. Later that day, after the midday meal had been eaten in a silence thick with unspoken thoughts, Julian placed an old, slightly rusted iron key on the rough-hewn kitchen table. He didn't say a word, just looked at Mabel, then Abigail, a silent question in his eyes, an offering. Then he pushed back his chair and headed out towards the barn, leaving them alone with the key and the decision. Mabel picked it up first, the cold metal heavy in her palm. She looked at Abigail. Together, Abigail nodded, her throat tight. The lock turned with a reluctant groan, the sound loud in the stillness. The door creaked open onto a room steeped in shadow and the faint, ghostly scent of lavender and old paper. Eliza's scent. A memory Abigail hadn't realized she'd held on to. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of light slanting from a grimy window, its shutters closed tight. It was as if time had stopped 3 years prior. A shawl lay draped over the back of a simple wooden rocker, as though its owner had just stepped away. On a small, unadorned dressing table, a silver-backed brush lay next to a small, velvet-lined box. Mabel opened it. Inside lay a few modest pieces of jewelry, a string of lusterless pearls, a tarnished silver locket, things of little monetary value, but precious in their intimacy Abigail was drawn to a bookshelf. Amongst well-worn volumes, one small book of poetry seemed to call to her. Its pages were filled with Eliza's delicate, spidery handwriting in the margins. Notes, thoughts, and sometimes entire verses of her own. Abigail's fingers traced the script. One, written beneath a poem about wildflowers, read like these: "My daughters bloom, wild and bright. May they find sun, not endless night." Tears welled, blurring the words. This was her mother. Not just a name, not just a ghost, but a woman who had loved and dreamed and despaired. Tucked into the back of the poetry book were photographs, faded and sepia-toned. One was of a younger Julian, his face less careworn, a hint of a smile playing on his lips, standing beside a woman with sad, beautiful eyes, Eliza. And then, the one that made both girls catch their breath, two small, solemn-faced children with wide eyes and identical pinafores, their hands clasped tightly together, themselves so young they were almost strangers. They spent hours in that room, touching Eliza's things, breathing her air, piecing together fragments of a life, of their own forgotten childhood. It wasn't a shrine to grief, like Julian might have kept for Anna. It was a room simply paused, waiting. When they finally emerged, blinking in the late afternoon sun, they felt changed, as if a missing part of themselves had been quietly restored. The next week, Julian led them to a patch of land behind the house. Overgrown with weeds and stubborn brush, "This used to be Anna's garden," he said, his voice distant. Then Eliza tried her hand at it for a spell. "Hasn't been touched in years. Thought maybe we could bring it back. Plant some vegetables, if you've a mind to." It was hard work. The ground was stubborn, baked hard by the sun, but under Julian's patient guidance, they cleared the weeds, turned the soil, and planted rows of seeds: beans, squash, corn. Mabel, surprisingly, took to it with a fierce determination, attacking the earth as if it were a personal enemy to be subdued. Abigail, more delicate, found a quiet satisfaction in nurturing the fragile seedlings. They worked side by side with Julian, the silence often broken only by the scrape of tools, the grunt of effort, or Julian's quiet instructions. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the spaces between them began to shrink. Evenings found them sharing meals that were less about sustenance and more about a quiet companionship. Mabel still watched Julian, but the suspicion in her eyes was slowly being replaced by a grudging respect, an awareness of his steady, quiet strength. Abigail found herself talking more, sharing small observations, sometimes even memories of Eliza that the room had unlocked. Julian would listen, his gaze thoughtful, occasionally offering a memory of his own, a small, polished stone from the past. He never pushed, never demanded. He offered them choices, a freedom they had never known. "You're free to go whenever you choose," he'd said once, his voice even. "This place, it's just a shelter, if you need it." But his presence was a constant, a shield against the harshness of the world they'd known, an unspoken promise of understanding. He was like the ancient, weathered cottonwood by the creek, scarred by time and storms, yet deeply rooted, offering steadfast shade. The house on the prairie was still quiet, but it was a living quiet now, filled with the tentative rustlings of a family, wounded but slowly, carefully, beginning to heal. What did you think of today's story? If it made your day, drop a good in the comments. If it didn't hit the mark, just type 1. Got your own thoughts? I'd love to hear them below. And hey, don't forget to hit subscribe. It's free, and it really helps the channel grow. Thank you so much for being here. The seasons on the high plains have a stark honesty to them. Summer had ripened the meager crops in their small, resurrected garden. The beans and squash a testament to shared labor. Autumn was now beginning to paint the prairie in hues of rust and gold, and the evenings carried a crisp reminder of the coming cold. A fragile peace had settled over Julian Cain's homestead, woven from routine, shared silences, and the tentative threads of belonging. The three of them had fallen into a rhythm, Julian tending to his few cattle and the heavier work, Mabel managing their small household with a fierce, quiet competence, and Abigail, whose gentle touch seemed to coax life from the most stubborn soil, tending the last of the garden and finding solace in the books Eliza had left behind. They were sitting on the porch one late afternoon, the sun slanting low, casting long shadows. Julian was mending a piece of harness, his movements economical and precise. Abigail was reading aloud from Eliza's book of poetry, her voice soft but clear, while Mabel listened, her hands busy shelling the last of the dried beans, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon. It was a scene of domestic tranquility, hard-won and precious. Then, an ill wind began to stir. It started as a flicker of movement at the edge of the property, a shape detaching itself from the shimmering heat haze. Julian's head came up slowly, his hand stilling. Mabel tensed, her shelling forgotten. Even old Bess, dozing in the small corral, lifted her head and gave a low, uneasy whicker. The figure resolved itself into a man on horseback, riding with a swagger that spoke of arrogance rather than confidence. As he drew closer, a cold dread settled in Julian's gut. He knew that slouch, that particular brand of menace. It was Colby, the burly, unshaven man from Nolan's horse market, the one whose eyes had held a greedy, proprietary gleam as he'd pocketed Julian's money for the girls. "Stay inside, both of you," Julian said, his voice low and level, but with an edge of steel that brooked no argument. He rose, laying the harness aside, and stepped down from the porch, his old Winchester rifle, which always leaned near the door, now in his hand. He didn't move towards Colby, just stood his ground, a solid, unyielding figure. Colby reined in his horse a dozen yards away, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. A cruel smirk twisted his lips. He had a Colt Peacemaker strapped to his hip, and his eyes, small and hard, raked over Julian, then darted towards the house. Well, Cain," Colby sneered, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "Didn't expect to find you playing house. Got tired of those fillies already. Or maybe you ain't man enough to handle 'em. State your business." "Colby," Julian said, his voice flat, betraying none of the cold anger coiling inside him. "Then ride out. You're not welcome here. My business." Colby chuckled, a harsh, grating sound. "I reckon those girls are my business. There was a misunderstanding about the price. A man offered me more after you'd skedaddled. I'm here to collect what's mine, or the difference." The lie was blatant, an ugly thing hanging in the air between them. He wasn't here for money. He was here for them, driven by a festering resentment and a bully's desire to dominate. "They're not for sale. Not then. Not now," Julian stated. "You made your bargain. Now leave." Colby's eyes narrowed. "I ain't leaving without 'em. Send 'em out, or things are gonna get real unfriendly. He casually rested his hand on the butt of his Colt. Before Julian could respond, the screen door creaked open. Mabel stepped out onto the porch, her face pale but set with a stubborn resolve. Abigail was right behind her, a silent echo of her sister's defiance. "Mabel, get back inside." Julian's command was sharp. "No," Mabel said, her voice surprisingly steady. She took a step forward, positioning herself slightly in front of Abigail. "This concerns us." Colby's smirk widened. "Well now, looky here. They come to greet their rightful owner. You own nothing here," Mabel said, her eyes, so like her mother's in that moment, blazing with a cold fire. Colby's amusement vanished, replaced by a dark flush of anger. "You insolent little—" He started to raise his hand, perhaps to gesture, perhaps to draw. What happened next was a blur. Julian shouted. Colby moved. There was a deafening roar as Colby's gun went off, fired wildly as he was startled by Mabel lunging forward. Not in fear, but in a desperate, protective fury. A piece of firewood she'd snatched from the porch box clutched in her hand. Mabel cried out, a sharp intake of breath, stumbling back a step, clutching her left forearm. Blood, shockingly bright, welled between her fingers. Julian leveled his Winchester. "That's enough." Colby. But it wasn't Julian's rifle that made Colby pause. It was the sight of the two girls. Mabel, though wounded, straightened up, her eyes never leaving Colby's, a fierce, almost feral protectiveness in her stance. Abigail, who had always seemed to shrink from conflict, stepped firmly to her sister's side, her small chin lifted, her gaze unwavering, mirroring Mabel's defiance. They stood together, two halves of a whole, small figures against the vast prairie, yet radiating a strength that was palpable, an unshakable solidarity that seemed to suck the bluster right out of him. Colby looked from the barrel of Julian's rifle to the twin stares of the girls. There was no fear in their eyes now, only a cold, hard resolve that promised a reckoning he hadn't bargained for. He saw not victims, but something ancient and formidable, the lie of his own power, his perceived right to them, crumbled. He was a bully, and bullies only thrive on fear. He saw none here. He licked his lips, his bravado deserting him. "This ain't over," he muttered. But the threat was hollow. He tugged hard on his horse's reins, wheeling the animal around, and galloped away, disappearing back into the haze from which he'd come, a defeated man running from a strength he couldn't comprehend. Julian lowered his rifle, his shoulders sagging slightly. He rushed to Mabel. Let me see. The bullet had only grazed her arm, a nasty flesh wound, but not life-threatening. Back in the kitchen, the air still thrumming with the aftermath of the confrontation, Julian cleaned and bandaged Mabel's arm with a gentleness that belied his rough exterior. Abigail, her face still pale, fetched water and cloths, her movements quick and efficient. "You shouldn't have come out," Julian said, his voice gruff with emotion as he tied off the bandage. "Both of you? He wasn't going to take us," Mabel said simply, wincing as the bandage tightened. "Not again." Abigail nodded, her eyes meeting Julian's. "This is our home now." Later, as twilight settled, casting a soft, forgiving glow over the land, Julian found Abigail sitting on the porch steps, a piece of smoothed pine board in her lap, carefully carving something with his whittling knife. He sat beside her, the comfortable silence stretching between them. She worked with quiet concentration, the knife moving with a surprising surety. Finally, she held it up, burned carefully into the wood, then deepened with the knife, were 3 words, the 3 rooms. A faint smile touched Julian's lips. He thought of the lonely house it had been, and what it was becoming. Seems about right, he said softly. Abigail looked at him, a shy smile of her own. I thought it needed a name. Tomorrow, he'd find some sturdy nails. They'd put it up above the door. It wasn't just Julian Cain's house anymore. It was their place, their sanctuary, a home named not for loneliness, but for the 3 souls who now shared its shelter, bound by hardship, by blood, and by the quiet courage it took to face down the ill winds and the lies of the world. Together, the morning after Colby's hasty retreat, a crisp autumn sun climbed into a sky, scrubbed clean by the night's cool wind. Julian, with a few carefully chosen nails and a hammer, fastened Abigail's carved sign above the sturdy wooden door. The 3 rooms. It looked right, somehow, humble, yet proclaiming a quiet dignity. It wasn't just a house anymore. It was a declaration. Mabel's arm, though still tender, was healing cleanly. The incident, terrifying as it had been, had burned away the last vestiges of her deep-seated suspicion. In its place, a fierce, protective loyalty had taken root, not just for Abigail, but for the quiet, steadfast man who had offered them sanctuary and stood his ground for them. She watched Julian now with a new clarity, her gaze no longer clouded by doubt, but sharpened by an understanding of his unassuming strength, his unwavering decency. It was a look that acknowledged a shared resilience, a bond forged in the face of threat. Life settled into a new, more deeply etched rhythm. The garden, which had been a tentative experiment, became a shared responsibility. Abigail, with her innate connection to growing things, coaxed vibrant life from the soil, her small flower patch by the porch, a splash of defiant color against the muted tones of the prairie. Mabel, practical and energetic, took charge of harvesting and preserving their modest bounty, her earlier fierceness now channeled into a purposeful industry. They mended fences together, patched the roof where winter threatened to find an entry, and whitewashed the kitchen walls until the little room gleamed. Each task, no matter how small, became a stitch in the fabric of their shared existence. Julian worked alongside them, his earlier solitude transformed into a quiet partnership. He taught them how to read the land, the sky, the subtle signs of changing weather, sharing the hard-won wisdom of a lifetime spent on the plains. One cool evening, as they sat by the warmth of the stove, the scent of wood smoke and brewing coffee filling the air, Abigail was looking through the small poetry book that had belonged to Eliza. She traced the familiar handwriting in the margins, a soft, wistful expression on her face. Julian watched her for a moment, then said quietly, his voice touched with a distant sorrow, "Your mother. She knew this land could be hard, especially for women alone, or for young ones." He paused, turning his worn hat in his hands. Before she left, she said to me, "Julian, life has a way of twisting a path. If my girls ever find themselves lost, if they're ever in real trouble and I'm not there, tell them to find Julian Cain. Just tell them to find you." He looked at them then, his gaze direct and filled with a quiet pain. "I reckon she always hoped to come back for you, or that, somehow, you'd find your way to safety." The words hung in the air, a testament to Eliza's desperate, far-reaching love and her faith in him. Mabel swallowed hard, Her usual composure momentarily shaken, Abigail closed her eyes, pressing the book to her chest, as if to absorb the very essence of her mother's troubled heart. The next afternoon, the air was still and golden. Abigail carried the poetry book out to the porch, where Julian was oiling tack and Mabel was mending a tear in one of Julian's work shirts. She hesitated for a moment, then opened the book, her voice a little shaky at first, then growing stronger as she began to read. The poems were of loss and longing, of the stark beauty of the wild, of resilience in the face of sorrow. They were words Eliza had cherished, words that had perhaps given her solace. As Abigail read, Eliza's spirit seemed to fill the quiet spaces between them, a gentle presence binding them closer. Julian stopped his work, listening, his expression unreadable, but for a profound stillness. Mabel's needle paused, her gaze soft as she looked at her sister, then at Julian. The shared act of listening, of honoring Eliza's memory in this way, was more profound than any spoken eulogy. In the days that followed, Mabel found herself observing Julian with that newly sharpened perspective. She saw the weariness in the lines around his eyes, but also the deep well of kindness he mostly kept hidden. She noticed the way he'd ensure the firewood box was full before a cold snap, the way he'd silently leave an extra blanket at the foot of their bed when the nights grew sharp, the quiet pride in his eyes when he looked at their thriving garden. There was no longer a question of his motives, no lingering doubt. There was just Julian, a man who had known loss and loneliness, who had, against all odds, opened his home and, incrementally, his heart. The bond between them wasn't one of obligation, but of a quiet, earned respect, a familial closeness that had grown as naturally and persistently as the prairie grass. The sign, "The 3 Rooms," became more than just a name for the weathered house. It was a symbol of their unspoken covenant. It stood for the 3 souls within, each having traded a past filled with uncertainty and pain for a present built on shared effort and mutual reliance. It represented the quiet unity they had forged, a family not by conventional ties or formal pronouncements. No vows taken, no grand welcomes exchanged, but by the steady accumulation of shared days, shared sorrows, and shared hope. It was a testament to the enduring strength found in unexpected places, a quiet acknowledgement that even in the vast, indifferent expanse of the West, a home and a family could be built from the most broken of pieces. And just like that, the house with 3 rooms wasn't just standing, it was living again. If this story stirred something in you, grief, warmth, maybe even hope, I'd love to hear what part stayed with you the most. Was it Mabel's fire, Abigail's quiet strength, or the man who thought he was too broken to save anyone? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. And if you want to walk further down these dusty trails with me, go on and hit that subscribe. We've got more stories to tell.